Dear students, good morning. This is a class for Asia Africa 1, March 31st, 2020. I'm recording this on Sunday, so I haven't received a reply yet for that email that I told you about for your mother tongue teachers. If you remember, on Monday, the class that we were supposed to have on March 30th, I told you that there is a link on my Moodle that is for your mother tongue teachers classes. The problem is that I don't know if this is for Asia Africa or just for Comparate. So I sent an email to my supervisors to ask them further information about that. So as soon as I get to know what that link is, who that link is for, I will put a little note on my Moodle and in the description box for this class. And I will let you know if you need a password for that. So just look for it on my Moodle. As for today, we're looking at, well, actually on Monday we were looking at English as an international lingua franca and why English has become the world's primary lingua franca. We said that there are several reasons, among which the main ones are historical reasons, because many countries have adopted English for their main institutions that work with English. Internal political reasons, for instance, there are situations of countries where there are several ethnic groups, and so English is used as a neutral means of communication. External economic reasons, of course, the United States of America now have a dominant economic position, so whoever wants to interact with them has to use English. In the past, it was British English with the UK. Now it is USA's English that is the dominant language. Of course, there are also practical reasons. English has been adopted in several fields, such as the international air traffic control, in the sailing, the maritime fields, emergency services, and many other services use English all around the world to communicate in their fields. Similarly, the same thing can be said for intellectual reasons, because the scientific, technological, and academic world use English around the world to communicate. English is also used for entertainment reasons. English is the main language of popular music, and if you like it or not, most of the songs that we listen to are in English. Okay, just think about it. How many, for instance, French songs can you listen to on the radio? Almost nothing at all. Most of the music is conveyed through English. And of course, you have to consider this. English is the language of prestige. If you speak English and an inner circle English and you speak it with a proper accent, it gives you a higher status than a person who, for instance, does not have a good accent, or instead of talking a good accent, it should be preferable. It should be better to talk about an inner circle English accent. Remember that towards the end of the class, we watched that video about Riccardo Pellegrino and how his change of accent from an Italian English accent to a British accent when he was flying gave him the rights to be perceived differently in the plane. And we looked at all those cultural differences, okay, between English-speaking countries and other countries around Europe in that video. And then we started the chapter on English used in Asia and in Europe, and how there are some similarities and differences between these two. Consider that there is that part of the expanding circle, Europe. Remember Cashew's scheme Okay, expanding circle is the last circle. And you have to notice that there are more and more people who are learning and using English, even if it's not institutionalized in their countries. It's not used in the government or at school. But at the same time, while English is used more and more in Asia and in Europe, language is changing. And there is the problem of understanding what has to be taught and how to test it. Kashrou defines these countries as linguistic orphans in search of their parents. What does this mean? That they, in a way, well, perhaps more in Asia than in Europe, do not recognize inner circle Englishes as their parents, and at the same time, they want to be recognized. Okay, they want to get out of that vicious circle in which they are considered deficient languages because they are getting away from inner circle Englishes. And then we got more into English and how it is used in Asia. There are several scholars that divide these languages, these Englishes that are spoken in Asia, in different ways. For instance, there is one theory that divides them by region. So there's South Asian varieties like India or Sri Lanka, Southeastern Asia like the Fiji, Malaysia, the Philippines, and the East Asian variety like China, Japan, or Korea. Or there are other scholars that divide them by use. Okay, this is like Kashrou's classification that divides these languages into institutionalized, outer circle, or non-institutionalized, belonging to the expanding circle. In the first case, some examples that we're going to look at is Brunei, India, the Philippines, or for the expanding circle, China, Japan, Korea. Okay. Within the institutionalized area, Indian and Lankan Englishes are the most developed and also the most studied. Little is known for the areas for other areas such as Bhutan, the Maldives, and Nepal. We looked at the difference between English in India and in Sri Lanka, and we said that the main difference is that in India, English has a unifying role because it puts together people that have different mother tongues. And this type of English has its own phonological, syntactic, lexical, and discursive features. Whereas in Sri Lanka, English does not have a neutral role. Okay, it does not put together people from that have different mother tongues. Actually, it is used more like a class marker. What does this mean? That it is the language spoken by the educated and the rich. This video that we watched together gave you some differences between Indians and Sri Lankans, because generally speaking, let's say in the Western world, we would not distinguish between these two populations, and so this gives us a clear idea of the differences. It's like saying that Spanish and Italian are the same languages. So that was the example. I added in some maps just to show you where we are in the world, okay, with India over here and Sri Lanka, this little island here. And that was the end of Monday's class. Now let's get into the other minorities. Okay, now let's look at the case of Brunei. I think I added in a map to show you where we are. Okay, this is where we were before, India, Sri Lanka. Now we're moving east and we're going to Brunei. Okay, still considered Asian. So what happens in Brunei? Malay is the main language group, okay? And its language, the Bahasa Melayu, I suppose, is the official language. And Brunei Malay is the most widely used. Okay. English is the most important non-native language. Okay, so there's the official language, that is Bahasa Melayu, and then Brunei Malay, that is the most widely used. Third language, let's say, that is the most important non-native language, is English. Here, English is institutionalized. It plays an important role in education. Brunei has a bilingual system for its education, and it is also used in law and in the media. In this country, attitudes towards English are positive. Okay, it is a well-accepted language, and there is actually code switching going on within the community of educated Bruneians. Code switching, remember, is that they recognize that one language has to be used in one context and the other in another. It's just like what we do with dialect, with our local dialects and standard Italian. So you can easily switch from one language to another depending on the context you are working or living in. So it is quite common for this population to use Malay and English in a process of code switching. Some scholars agree that probably Brunei will undergo a further shift towards English in the future. Okay, so we saw what happens in India, saw what happens in Sri Lanka, and in Brunei. Now, let's move to the Fiji. Let's new map. Okay, we are here, Fiji Islands. Further east, this is Australia. So east of Australia, okay, you can see there are the Fiji Islands. What happens here? In the Fijis, English is the national language. It is highly institutionalized, totally institutionalized, I would say, because it is used in education, in the government, and it is the language that is used for business. Here, English is used as the language of communication among the Fiji's different ethnic groups. Okay, remember, it has more or less the same role that English has in India. It has become the language that allows different populations to communicate. And the same thing happens here with several ethnic groups. Scholars say that Fiji English is a little further because it has its own distinctive local variety. Okay, so it has sort of evolved from standard English. It has its own patterns, it has its own grammar, and so it is highly institutionalized. Other part, let's go a little towards west and look at what happens in Malaysia, okay, which is close to Brunei. Let's see what happens. In Malaysia, there are 80 languages. And Malay, also known as Bahasa Malaysia, is the national language. And it is used as the primary lingua franca in the area. English is the second most important language. And it is used together with Chinese, Tamil, and other Indian languages to as the source of communication, the means of communication among different ethnic communities. This country has reached a good level of proficiency in English. And here, just like we saw in another country, let me check that I don't remember. Just like what has happening in Brunei. Also in this case, there is good, these people master how to do code switching between English and Malay. Okay, so remember that the same situation is more or less what they're living in Brunei. Okay, over here. Malaysia and Brunei. And then I think the last one. So the last one that we're going to look at is the Philippines. Going back to the map, we're up here. Let me give you this other map, it's better. Okay, the Philippines, we're here. We looked at India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, and south here, there are the Fijis. What is going on in the Philippines? English is the second language of the Philippines, and their education is formally bilingual. There's both English and Filipino or Tagalog, remember we watched some videos about it, that are used both in education. However, Tagalog or Filipino is the national lingua franca. While English is used more when in those situations where there are several cultures that have to communicate, and so that's where they would use English. The Philippines, just like we saw in the videos that we watched a couple of classes ago, has a very distinctive variety of English. Okay, and the thing is that it is continuously evolving, and that is the reason why, if you remember, that was that video about that girl that said, well, my cousin that lives in the United States does not understand Taglish, that is the English variety of English, the Philippines variety of English, because the language is evolving so much and at such a fast rate that there is actually a difference between older and younger generations. Okay. Okay. So what we analyzed looking at India, Malaysia, Brunei, Fiji, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines, we looked at some features that all these countries have in common. They are part of the outer circle. This means that they use institutionalized English. That English is institutionalized, meaning that it's used in education, in the government, and in other formal fields. Some of these countries use code switching. This means that the population knows when to switch between their local language and the variety of English that is used in their countries. Obviously, I am not asking you to tell me the features of all these countries, of the English that is used in all these countries. What I wanted to show you is how language is used in these countries, that is something that, for instance, does not happen in the expanding circle. Okay. It was just a description of what happens. Okay. What I ask you actually to reflect on is the fact that how, for instance, India and Lankan English are different, not mainly for their characteristics, but for the role that they occupy in these two countries. That is so different. Okay. And how in these countries English is so deeply rooted in their education, their government, and their business that people know how to do code switching. They know when to use which language. Especially also another thing that I want you to reflect on is the fact that in many of these countries there are so many languages, and English is used as their primary but also secondary lingua franca. Okay, depending on where you are and the major or minor influence that English has had on these countries. Code switching makes you think of another idea. These are countries that have not rejected their own languages. They are not totally subjected to the English culture. They are trying to keep their own identity, okay? Because probably, actually, for many people in the Western world, Asia is just Asia. We don't understand how many cultures, how many populations, how many countries there are under the word Asia. So this list of features actually shows you the variety that we can find in this continent, and how these people are struggling or trying. I wouldn't even use the word to struggle. They're coping with a world that is changing, that uses English more and more, and how they are trying to protect their differences. Before we move on to how English is used in Europe, I want you to pause this video and watch this 10-minute video about an Asian person who tries to, let's say, unveil the stereotypes that are typically attributed to Asian people. Okay, it is not only about language, but also about culture, and hopefully it will make you think of how many times we use Asian, linking some stereotypes to it. Pause the video and watch this one. Okay, so as you can see, even without wanting to, we have so many stereotypes for each population. And so maybe next time we should be more attentive, more careful to what we are saying and how we think. Now, moving very briefly to Europe, I know that you all study Asian and African languages, so whenever there are parts of the book that refer to Europe, I go quite quickly through them, trying to focus more on what could be interesting for you. But let's look at what's happening in Europe. Well, Europe, according to this book, has 234 languages, but the main ones are English, French, and German. Well, here it's all a matter of being powerful from an economic point of view. Because those who speak one of these three languages, English, French, German, Spanish and Italian are getting in, but still, the truth is that these are the main languages. If you speak one of these big languages, you have more access to material and so economical success. The thing is that there is a difference between Europe and the European Union and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And it is that for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, English is the working language. It's the official working language. This does not happen within the European Union because English, in this case, is not the official language, working language. The EU basically is grounded on translation and interpreting. All the documents have to be translated into one of the official languages of the EU. The fact is that in the ASEAN system, English is the working language, but in Europe it is not. It is only the de facto, not the de jure lingua franca. Okay? Excuse me just a second. I'll be right back. Okay, I apologize for the interruption. Where were we? Okay, yes, so there's that. We were talking about the difference between Southeast Asian nations and the European Union. So that was basically what I wanted to show you. The difference between Asian countries and Europe is that in Europe it is not, English is not the de jure lingua franca, at least at an institutional level. Plus, now let's look at the future of global Englishes, A8. You have to consider that at an international language, at an international level, English is not distributed. It does not have an a priori set of established encoded forms. It was not, let's say, imposed. It was spread as a virtual language. What does this mean? That it just spread throughout the world. The usage was not imposed, so distributed. It was spread, okay, for all the reasons that I gave you before. In this way, English has gone from those inner circle countries throughout the whole world. It has become the language of others. The thing is that if English has to become the language of others, all the different types, all the different varieties of English have to have the same language rights as those claimed by the mother tongue, the inner circle speakers. They have to have the same rights. It is no longer proper to say that an English right is correct or incorrect, because if you say that a language is correct or incorrect, proper or improper, you're always comparing it to another language, which is the inner circle Englishes. The problem is that all the differences that we see between inner circle Englishes and other varieties of English are due to several factors. One being the fact that English orthography, the way we write things, cannot be predicted depending on how a word is pronounced. What does this mean? That sometimes the way you pronounce a word is totally different from how you spell it. And consider that English is difficult also for mother tongue let's say the inner circle learners, okay, that really have a hard time with writing, with spelling their own words, okay? Consider famous spelling bees. Why do children do spelling bees? Because words are difficult. They're difficult to learn. Kids have to learn how to spell words that are pronounced in a totally different way. Okay, there are silent letters, weird pronunciations, and that is part of the difficulty of English. Okay? And then consider the grammatical difficulties of English. Okay? And you, more than anybody else, knows how difficult verb forms are, how to use verb forms. And imagine learning all phrasal verbs and prepositional verbs. English is difficult, not only for orthography, so how you write things, but also for how words are put together to make a grammatically correct sentence. English is difficult. And so these new varieties of English are trying to solve these issues, okay, by making an English closer to a practical usage, trying to get rid of all those difficulties that learners can encounter. But again, the problem is to face the dilemma of whether these Englishes should be considered proper or improper, if they are incorrect English or they just have to be accepted as varieties of English on their own. Because English is no longer belong to only the inner circle populations. And then this part of your book ends with a reflection on the internet. How the internet is going to influence the usage and the forms of English. In some cases, maybe it is no longer correct to talk about English as a lingua franca, but we have to consider it the other way around. That is a lingua franca English. This concept will be further explained in David Crystal's video that we are going to watch together in a moment. But think of how different these two words are. Okay? Let me write it here. English as a lingua franca versus a lingua franca English. In the first case, English as a lingua franca, we are starting from an inner circle English that becomes a lingua franca used around the world. But the concept that is behind the second phrase, a lingua franca English, is something totally different. It's the other way around. It means to adopt a type of English that is a lingua franca. Okay? In this case, the head of the phrase is English, but it's not the departure point. In this first case, we move from English to a lingua franca that has its root in an inner circle English. In this other phrase, a lingua franca English, we are no longer saying that this English that has to be used belongs to any population that is part of the inner circle of Englishes. Okay? It is a language of its own. And going back to what I was saying about the internet, this phenomenon, internet, is definitely going to influence the usage of English more and more. Because within the domain of the internet, English is used by the whole world. And we cannot expect the whole world to learn an inner circle English perfectly. Plus, we have to consider that Chinese is catching up fast, and there are 408 million users. And they make up about 23% of all the internet users. Okay? Okay, so second and last video that I want you to watch for today is by David Crystal. And it is about what I was saying before. Will English always be the global language? In this 13-minute video, he analyzes how and if English can become the lingua franca, and what are the phenomena that influence its usage around the world, and how the world moves from using British English to American English, and if the world has changed from British English to American English for all the reasons that he will describe, nothing can avoid perhaps a further evolution in which it will be no longer American English to be the main point of reference, but probably we will evolve towards something that is no longer totally linked to inner circle Englishes. Okay. So, what did we do today? We focused more on Asian Englishes, and we looked at several cases, Indian and Sri Lanka first, and then we moved on to other countries, such as Brunei, and Malaysia, where code switching is pretty common. People understand when to use their local varieties, their local languages, and when to use English, their variety of English. Or other cases, like the Fijis, where English is the national language. And so it is deeply rooted into the education, government, and business system of this area. There are other cases where English is the second language, for instance in the Philippines, where both English and Tagalog are used for their education. In this case, English is not the national lingua franca, but it is used more for cross-cultural communication. And so I told you that even if I don't want you to tell me all the distinctive features of all these languages, but I focused on this area because I wanted to show you that actually there are some differences in Asia and how English is used in these areas. They are all countries where English is institutionalized, so used for the government, school, law, and so on, but every country has its own distinctive features. And this is what led us into that debate about whether English could replace local languages or not, and what the risks are for that. We looked at the differences between Asia and what's going on in Asia and what is going on in Europe, and how in Europe, in the European Union, is a different situation because English is just the de facto but not the de jure lingua franca used at an institutional level. So now we are slowly getting into what is the topic of section B of your book, about whether English is moving from being something that belongs only to the inner circle languages to something that is going global. And if it is going global, every variety of English has to have the same language rights as those who use it as their mother tongue, especially those who belong to the inner circle populations. The second part of this course is going to be a little more question based. Okay, I have to change the course a little because I expected it to be a more interactive part based on debates in class. So I'll see what I can do to change it, to adapt it to these video courses. Okay, let's say that I would consider this part A, the most difficult part of the course. Okay, the second part is more based on comments by several scholars and questions that could be that I want you to reflect on. And that could become also questions that I might ask you for your exam. The main idea of the second part is how varieties of English should be considered. Okay, and it is also based on cultural discrimination. It is more, let's say, linked to social and contextual features. So I'll need to change that a little, but at the same time, I will ask you, and I would be glad to see comments in the video, in the comment box, about what you think about the issues that we are going to look at for the second part of the text. So I don't remember if I told you to pause this video. You can do it now and watch David Crystal's video if I haven't asked you to do so. And this is the end of the class. I will now put the 2 links over here. This one about Asian stereotypes. over here. And this one over here. And you will find them in the comment box. I just want to reassure you that I'm not going to ask you to give me all these details, okay? Just pick a couple of languages that you're interested in, again, depending on what you've studied, and focus on those. I will give you very general questions about this part, okay? Thank you for watching. And wait a second. No, I forgot the song. Just a second, please. Okay. Sorry for that. I almost forgot your song. So today's song is Vienna by Billy Joel. Sorry, I'm horrible with music. So I'll read the text now, the lyrics now. Slow down, you crazy child. You're so ambitious for a juvenile. But then, if you're so smart, tell me, why are you still afraid? Where's the fire? What's the hurry about? You better cool it off before you burn it out. You got so much to do and only so many hours in a day. Yes, we're living this. But you know that when the truth is told, that you can get what you want, or you can just get old. You're gonna kick off before you even get halfway through. When will you realize Vienna waits for you? Slow down, you're doing fine. You can't be everything you want to be before your time. Although it's so romantic on the borderline tonight. Too bad, but it's the life you lead. You're so ahead of yourself that you forgot what you need. Though you can see when you're wrong. You know you can't always see when you're right. You got your passion, you got your pride, but don't you know that only fools are satisfied? Dream on, but don't imagine they'll all come true. When will you realize Vienna waits for you? Slow down, you crazy child. Take the phone off the hook and disappear for a while. When you still put phones on the hook. It's all right, you can afford to lose a day or two. When you realize Vienna is waiting for you. And you know, when the truth is told, that you can get what you want, or you can just get old. You're gonna kick off before you even get halfway through. Why don't you realize Vienna is waiting for you? Okay, let me get your link to the song. And here's the link. Thank you for watching. Look for that comment on the Moodle and your mother tongue teachers within my Moodle. Thank you for watching and have a nice day. See you next week. Bye. Take care. Stay safe. Bye.